Using my airbrush, I begin to prime the model using a mixture of 1 part Vallejo Game Color white primer and 1 part Windex. I'm careful to work in multiple thin coats so I get a nice smooth, even finish. I then begin mixing up a wash using Game Color Sepia ink. This is thinned down 6 parts sepia ink to 4 parts water. This wash mixture is applied liberally over the entire model. This will create nice dark recesses, which is going to enable nice crisp shadows in between armor platings. I place a liberal amount of Games Workshop Foundation Paint Earden Dark Sun on my palette. This is thinned down to quite a thin consistency. This will take several coats to cover over the sepia background, but it will get an overall result that is far superior to covering it up with 1 or 2 thick layers of paint. As you can see, I'm applying multiple thin layers to the armor plates. This is going to basically base coat the armor plates in the nice Earden Dark Sun colour, while leaving the recesses and the cracks and crevices in between the armor plates in the dark sepia colour. This is clearly a lengthy process, and I've had to cut out a lot of the footage of me doing this, simply because it would take far too long in this video. But you can see clearly here the difference between the before and after stages. As you can see, before we have a rather messy looking sepia coloured model, and afterwards we have nice, clean armour plates outlined with the dark shadows of sepia. To begin with painting the flesh tones, I start by thinning down some Games Workshop Talon flesh. This is thinned to a similar consistency to the yellow paint that was used on the power armor, and is applied in a similar way, allowing the sepia to show through in the deepest recesses. All the bone areas, and also areas that are going to be parchment colour, are going to be base coated using bleached bone. I then base coat all of the red areas using blood red. As you can see here, as with the previous steps, I'm still using thinned paint, and of course where I think that more shadows would be necessary, I leave sepia in the recesses as opposed to covering entirely with the base colour of my choice. Then both the blood red areas and bleached bone areas are given a wash of slightly thinned down Devlan mud wash. You'll notice that I have managed to do these stages kind of out of order, but really it doesn't matter what order you do things in, just as long as all the areas end up being base coated and then shaded with the Devlan mud wash. I'm now going to begin to create my highlights and shades for the power armor on the model. To highlight the power armor, I'm going to be using a mix of the original base coat, which is of course Earden Dark Sun, and I'm going to be adding in some yellow. Any sort of yellow will do, but here I used Sunburst yellow, and a little bit of white, because I don't want it to be a really pure bright yellow. I want it to kind of be an off sort of yellow. For the shades, I'm going to be taking, of course, again the original base coat, and I'm going to be mixing in a tiny dot of purple. Okay, any purple will do. And the reason I'm using purple is the complementary colour of yellow. Now you can look this up on a colour wheel, you can Google it and you'll come up with heaps of them, but basically what a complementary colour is it's just the colour that's opposite the chosen colour on the colour wheel. And complementary colours look nice together, but also they can be used to shade one another. So it's always worth keeping that in mind, and if you're stuck for ideas, you want to do something a bit interesting, then you can always take the complementary colour of the colour you're trying to shade and mix a bit of that in, and you'll end up with a darker tone. As you can see, all of these colours being mixed up on my wet palette, so I won't have to worry about my paint drying out as I'm doing my highlighting and shading. It just means that I don't have to work with precise ratios when I'm mixing up my highlights, because I won't need to remix up any of these colour tones. One thing you might have noticed is my shade and my highlight are quite far away from the actual colour of the Earden Dark Sun, and it's far too much of a gap to normally make a nice transition between the two colours. That's okay, because what I intend on doing is going back with the mid-tone and smoothing the transition together. To begin with, I start by shading and highlighting the model. Very simple, no rocket science behind it really. All it is just using thin down paint and a layering technique to layer on the highlights and the shades, making sure that I have a nice mid-tone left, because this is where I'm going to be able to blend the transition between the different colours. Now this takes a little while. I do try and keep the coat smooth and try and get a sort of blended appearance. It doesn't really matter, but you do want to avoid getting really stark kind of lines where you've stuck the highlights and the shades, because it will make it more difficult to smooth out the transitions later. Now that I've blocked out the basic highlights and shades, I need to refine the transition between the different colours to make it look smooth and realistic. To do this, I'm going to use washes and glazes of the initial base coat, which was of course the Earden Dark Sun. What I do is I simply take a little on my wet palette and I thin it down quite a bit so it's a nice, smooth, thin consistency like that of a wash or a glaze. I then apply thinned washes and glazes over the highlight areas and the shadow areas. I never cover the areas entirely, but I kind of just smear kind of the colour in the area between the transition that goes from the light to the dark, or the dark to the light colours. This will mean that I get a smooth blend as opposed to the jagged lines and transitions that I currently have. This process can take quite a while, so again I've had to skip ahead quite a bit, but it is quite effective and it gets quite a nice result for such a short amount of time. I'm now using Vallejo Model Air Color Black to base coat all of the areas that are either going to be black or painted in metallic color. For the metallics, I'm going to be using some of the metallic paints from the Vallejo Liquid Gold line. Today I'm going to be using the top two metallic paints. These are of course silver and gold. The areas that I want to be silver are base coated obviously in silver paint. The gold areas, mainly the area around the hilt of the sword, is then base coated obviously in gold paint. All the silver areas are given a black wash of Badab Black Wash. All the gold areas are given a wash of Devlan Mud. The metallic colours are then re-highlighted with their original base colours. I'm now going to start shading and highlighting the iron halo a little bit further. Because this is kind of a focal point on the miniature, because it's right up the top of the model, I need to do a bit of a more impressive metallic paint job on this. What I start off by doing is I start off by shading the underside or the more angled side of the metallic areas, and for this of course I'm going to be using Butter Black Shade. So I'm just picking out the edges which are facing downwards and I'm shading them using this black wash. Now on the top there's one raised spike and neither side of the spike are facing down, so I just pick one of the sides, it doesn't matter which one, and I shade that. I then highlight the more raised sides of the spikes, and for this I'm going to be using Game Color Silver Metallic Paint. For the extreme highlights, I'm going to be using a bit of silver mixed in with some white, and this is just going to be painted onto the rivets as well as along the edges of the armoured spikes. A thinned glaze of purple ink is then applied to the metallic areas. This will give it a nice kind of purplish tone, which is going to complement the yellow of the model. All the black areas are highlighted with a very dark grey. All the surfaces that are going to receive decals are given a coat of gloss varnish.